Hassan. Thank you so much for joining us. Actually, hold on just one moment. Hi,
Hi,
Hassan.
Hassan. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so much
much
for
for
joining
joining
us.
us. Actually, hold.
I hear a little echo there.
Yes, that's been straightened out now. Thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thanks for having me, Ariel. How you doing?
Doing well. If you could start us off with just an update of where things are at with this ongoing brutal war in Yemen that now is impacted by COVID as well.
Yeah, so in its sixth year, Yemen Yemenis are especially vulnerable right now during this global pandemic. After 5 years of brutal warfare, as many as 80% of Yemenis are living right now, um, you know, basically with needed humanitarian assistance and protection. 50% of the healthcare facilities have been closed or destroyed due to the war. And there are about 14 million people living on the brink of famine. And to make matters worse, last Friday night, UNICEF actually reported that as many as 2.4 million children by the end of this year could die of starvation if nothing changes. So it was the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the planet before COVID, and now with COVID and all the aid suspensions and aid cuts happening at USAID, WHO, the UN, and World Food Program, Yemen is indeed in crisis.
What are the COVID cases like there now, and how are the hospitals coping?
Yeah, so it's a disaster. Yemen needs support from the international community right now. There are shortages of absolutely everything needed to treat people with COVID-19. They need test swabs. They need hospital beds, ICU beds, ventilators, oxygen, PPE, and the situation is just really desperate. So far, there are varying reports. We don't have the best numbers right now for the amount of cases of COVID-19 because they really just lack the testing. But the numbers we do know are the people that, when they do contract COVID-19 in different parts of the country, the fatality rates are anywhere between 25 and 50%, which is absolutely staggering.
Right, I heard that. That's an
Yeah.
enormously high death rate, and on top of the hunger issue.
Mhm.
Could you talk about what aid has been, what the cuts have been so far, and the work being done to restore that aid?
Yeah, so I've been following this for quite a while, as you know, and in March of this year, USAID announced a $73 million suspension of aid going to North Yemen. And this has already been appropriated by Congress. And the reason was that they were concerned about Houthi obstruction of humanitarian assistance, that it wasn't getting into the areas that they wanted to. So they moved ahead with that, and they did it unilaterally. And following suit, they put pressure, as you know, on other programs around the country. Around international programs, including the UN, WHO, and the World Food Program. So there's been cuts and suspensions all across the board, unfortunately. So we there's been a lot of advocacy. Members of Congress are speaking out, thankfully. Chairman Smith and Chairman Engel issued a letter at the beginning of that aid suspension to USAID, and they put some pressure. The administration announced that they would release $500,000, which is a pittance, and then 1.7 million after more members spoke out. And then there was a letter actually pushed by Senator Cardin, Senator Young, Senator Reid and Senator Sanders and others. And shortly thereafter, the administration announced a $225 million infusion for World Food Program funding, which was great. And while that's welcome, these funds are only earmarked for food aid to Yemen. And Yemen also needs medical emergency assistance. So we're concerned about that. We're also concerned that it's not getting to North Yemen, which is, not enough people are talking about this, but that's where 70% of the population lives. So we welcome the 225 million, but we need so much more than that. Uh, just a few weeks ago, the UN held a virtual donor summit, and they were trying to raise about $2.4 billion from international donors. And unfortunately, they did raise 1.3 or so billion, but they're about $1 billion short of what they need to really address a lot of the humanitarian suffering and the crises in Yemen, exacerbated by the outbreaks of COVID-19.
Wow. What I'm hearing, though, as well, is that members of Congress speaking out really has an impact. And this is something that can be productive. Are there things in the works now with Congress?
Yeah, so FCNL, and thank you so much to Code Pink. You all signed this letter effort that we put together, and that's exactly what we need right now. FCNL, we led a letter along with Yemeni Alliance Committee, Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and about 80 or so other folks to pressure key members of Congress in the House and Senate to restore humanitarian assistance and USAID funding to Yemen during this global pandemic. And we've done meetings with each of these key members. There are about 12 folks in the House and Senate, the chairs and ranking members of oversight, foreign relations, and appropriations, all key committees that relate to and that deal with USAID directly. We've heard that the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are using that letter as leverage in negotiations with USAID right now. And so what we've decided to do is because that drumbeat seems to be helping the situation, what we're doing is we're going to open the letter back up for new signatories between now and July 15th, which happens to be the day of a national day of action for Yemen, and people can call their reps and amplify the message. No U.S. support for the war. What we want is U.S. aid funding to go to Yemen and the people that need it most. So we're trying to re-up that letter and get more pressure on these members.
So I'm excited for this July 15th day of action. We've been doing actions for Yemen for far too long now.
Yeah.
Of course, along with that aid, we have to stop the war. If we don't get to the root part of the problem, we are not going to solve the crisis that is exacerbating the COVID crisis. Could you talk about what's happening on the Hill and in any other place to either get the war powers resolution through and or finally block the arms sales from the US to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, good questions here. So a lot's being done. Obviously, not enough is being done because this situation requires urgent action. And so right now, the Congress in the House and Senate, they're considering the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year of 2021. And so we've been following that. There are provisions in the House and Senate that would end U.S. support for the war. And just to reiterate to the guests and the people tuning in, the United States for the past 5 years plus have been providing logistical support for Saudi airstrikes, intelligence sharing, and also billions and billions of dollars of weapon sales to the coalition. So the U.S. is we're not just passively, watching this happen. We are an active participant in so many of these airstrikes that are raining down on the people of Yemen. And these airstrikes have blown up about 70 hospitals since the start of the war. That blood is on our hands. We are complicit in this violence. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act, Representative Ro Khanna, on, I believe, this Wednesday, is introducing an amendment to the House Armed Services Committee markup of the NDAA that would indeed end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war. And so we're tracking that. We're trying to get, if you're a member, if someone's listening and your member is on the House Armed Services Committee, ask them to vote in favor of this critical amendment to end U.S. support for the war. On the Senate side, it's a little bit more tricky. We don't know if we're going to actually get a vote, but folks, I think, should be urging that Senator Schumer, the Senate leader of the Democrats, that he do everything he can to force a vote on the Senate floor for the NDAA to include Senator Sanders, Senator Lee, and Senator Murphy's amendment to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war as well. So those are definitely two efforts. We don't know yet who's going to be introducing a provision on weapon sales. I've definitely been keeping my ear to the ground about that. I'm hoping that Representative Malinowski will introduce that provision again. He did last year, and it passed with bipartisan support. And we're urging that he does again this year on the House floor. And with COVID-19, as you probably know, Ariel, the situation on the, as far as getting the votes on these critical provisions, it's a little bit unclear whether or not we're going to get certain votes because it just takes so much longer now for them to go through the process of making these votes. It takes like 4 times, maybe more as long. So they're doing a truncated amendment process, but we're doing everything we can to urge that the House still take Yemen seriously because Yemen can't wait.
Now, we worked on this last year with you, and in the end, we got the votes, but we didn't actually end up with the amendment. Can you talk about what that process was and any different directions that are being taken this time, and if we should be hopeful that this year we'll actually get it all the way through?
So, yes.
Did we lose you? We might have lost Hassan. Oh, he's back. Go ahead.
Oh, was I paused there for a
lost
second?
you for a second. If you can just start again.
Yeah. So I don't want to get people's hopes up too high because the NDAA this year, we're pretty sure that they want to do a bipartisan process, so they don't want to put anything in the NDAA or force things through conference that they don't expect to get bipartisan support and that they don't expect to be signed by the president. It's an election year, and folks are worried about, campaigns. They're worried about the November 3 presidential election, and rightfully so. So unfortunately, I don't have the highest expectations for this year's NDAA. But that said, this is one pressure point. We are putting as much pressure as we can on members, and I think that's really important. One thing I wanted to flag for people is, even though we might not get the provisions all the way through, we can set important markers down. And well, one, never give up. Keep pushing. But
absolutely. Let's remember how few members of Congress we had supporting this originally. This has been an enormous amount of work.
Yeah. And so I think that's a really critical point, that we have to just keep building support. We know what we need to do. We need to keep building a mass movement to end support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And I want to flag also that we've seen these things actually make a meaningful impact on the ground in Yemen and change calculations in Riyadh and in the UAE. It's no coincidence that after the first Yemen War Powers resolution that passed in December 2018, that we saw the Stockholm Agreement, and that paved the way for a ceasefire in the port city of Hodeidah. And that was, like I said, that was signed the same day that Congress passed that legislation to end support for the war. And following the ceasefire, Congress forced more votes to end U.S. support for the Yemen war, and we helped push the UAE to draw down militarily. We spurred a reduction in cross-border violence between Saudi and the Houthis, and we revived negotiations between the warring parties. And in 2019, there was a major reduction in violence. And, I think that was in large part due to this congressional action. But unfortunately, once congressional negotiators dropped these provisions to end military assistance for the war, we saw those negotiations break down and the violence escalate quite dramatically. And Saudi air raids increased, and by you know it's just been a disaster. So I guess what I would take from that is that this congressional pressure is really important. So we need to get members to be as loud as they can about this. We need to win these votes with the largest majorities possible and get bipartisan support. And keep in mind that all of these bills have only passed because we've got Republicans on them.
So I want to let our listeners know that we at Code Pink will be working on a list of amendments in the NDAA to support, including Bernie Sanders' amendment to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. And we'll be asking people to email their members of Congress and tell them what things need to remain in the NDAA. Hassan, anything else that we should be watching out for right now about Yemen?
Well, I really think, one, we need to urge our members take this seriously. They need to be as loud as they can. They need to vote for these provisions if they get, if and when they get a chance to. They need to do more than that. They need to reach out, even if your member is not on the House Armed Services Committee. They've got an email address of the chairman, and they can reach out to them directly and say, this has to make it through. Do everything you can, lean on the members that you need to lean on, and get this provision through. Because after 5 years of unimaginable human suffering, Yemen can't wait any longer. And Congress has to renew its efforts if that means introducing another war powers resolution to end support for the war, if that means taking Donald Trump to court, take him to the Supreme Court and sue him over Article 1, Section 8 War Authority. And Congress has the power to keep the pressure going, and that's exactly what they need to do. And it's the only way I see us bringing this war to an end. And beyond that, we need to restore funding to Yemen. It's unconscionable that we would support Saudi Arabia as they've blown up, dozens and dozens and dozens of hospitals and turn our back on them when they need us most.
Absolutely. This week, Brian Hook was in Saudi Arabia to campaign with the Saudis to keep the embargo on arms, on Iranian arms. And in the meantime, the U.S. is selling arms to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen.
Yeah. It's wild times, but I really appreciate this program and that you having me on, and I appreciate all the work that Code Pink does to end support for this war and to really hold human rights abusers accountable wherever they are.
Well, we appreciate all the work that FCNL does and your incredible devotion to this issue in Yemen, and how hard you're working to end that war. And we look forward to joining you on July 15th for the Day of Action for Yemen.
Thank you. And anyone out there listening, just call your rep on July 15th and help us drive home the message that Yemen can't wait.